Before humans carved the first symbols into stone, before the first word or memory, the Earth had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. Entire worlds had risen, burned, and vanished, each leaving only bones and whispers behind. Yet the story of life did not end with the dinosaurs. It began again in silence. From that silence came creatures of fur and thunder, forests that breathed, and seas ruled by giants. This is the forgotten epic of the Cenozoic, the age when the Earth rebuilt itself from ash, when mammals inherited a wounded world, and when every step, every heartbeat, every breath of survival carried us closer to the age of humankind. Listen carefully, for beneath your feet lie the echoes of empires older than memory. Their story is not about extinction, it's about endurance. The fire has faded, but the embers of life still glow beneath the ash. From silence, the Earth begins again. The world had fallen silent, as if sound itself had been scorched from the air. For a time, nothing moved. The sky, once blue and alive with wings, had turned into a heavy dome of ash that dimmed the sun into a pale ghost. The ground was a crust of soot and shattered bone. Oceans fumed with acid. Rivers ran thick with mud, and mountains wept black rain that never seemed to end. The age of giants had vanished in fire, leaving behind a planet that no longer remembered color. Yet beneath that suffocating stillness, life persisted. In the charred hollows of fallen trees, tiny creatures stirred, warm-blooded, shivering, and blind to the light that barely reached the surface. Their hearts beat fast, too fast for extinction to catch them. They crept through ferns that had somehow returned first, their curling fronds piercing the soot like green punctuation marks in a sentence of death. With each dawn, the haze thinned a little, and the smell of rot gave way to something new. Wet soil, alive again. The survivors were not beautiful. They were small, gray, unremarkable. The first birds, descendants of creatures that had once ruled the heavens, fluttered weakly from branch to branch, smaller now, cautious, whispering the memory of flight. From the edges of volcanic plains, lizards ventured out of the cracks, their scales gleaming faintly in the filtered light. They basked on stones still warm from the planet's fever, watching the movements of the mammals below. Nature seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain which lineage would inherit what remained. In that fragile balance, reptiles still held their ancient poise, their jaws and claws reminding the world of what had been. For a time, it looked as though they might rise again. The heat, the humidity, the still air. It was a climate made for scales and cold blood. Some reptiles grew larger, fed by the abundance of insects and the endless warmth. But it was only an illusion of return. Their time had already passed, though the Earth had not yet realized it. Deep in the forests, the mammals multiplied. They stayed hidden during the day and emerged at night, their senses sharp, their minds restless. They learned to listen to the dripping of water from ferns, the croak of distant frogs, the faint rumble of the earth as it healed. They carried warmth within them, a secret fire that did not depend on the sun. In a world still wrapped in darkness, that fire was their strength. Volcanoes bled into the sea. The air shimmered with ash and steam. From the blackened shores, the first shoots of grass took hold, and wind began to move again, clearing the sky grain by grain. Beneath that clearing veil, rivers found their old paths and carved new ones. Fish returned to the shallows, birds grew stronger, and the small mammals began to explore farther from their burrows. The quiet no longer felt like death. It felt like breath held before a word. Every creature that moved carried the weight of what had come before, and the faint promise of what would come after. In this new dawn, the world was not yet ruled by strength or size, but by endurance. The reptiles watched, waiting for their second reign, unaware that the crown was already slipping away. In the stillness after the fire, under skies still gray and trembling, life was learning again how to breathe. The earth had inward, testing patience, speed, and adaptability. Among the roots of ancient ferns and cycads, the smallest mammals thrived. They darted through tunnels of moss, their hearts beating fast as hummingbird wings. Shrew-like creatures sniffed for beetles under bark, their soft bodies quivering with constant motion. They lived fast, died young, and left behind broods that learned to run before they could see. It was not elegance that saved them, but momentum, a relentless drive to multiply, adapt, and move forward before the world could change again. In the canopy above, new forms were taking shape. Early primates, tiny, wide-eyed, restless, leapt between branches, their grasping fingers and tails learning balance in half-light. The forest roof was dim and humid, filled with the drone of insects and the soft crackle of rain on leaves. Here, survival meant awareness, not dominance. Eyes widened to read shadows, ears sharpened to the whisper of wings. These creatures were cautious, nervous but curious, traits that would one day define far greater minds. Beneath them, in the undergrowth and open glades, another experiment began. Small, hoofed mammals, prototypes of later herds, tested new ways of moving. Their teeth thickened, reshaped to grind young shoots and soft leaves. Their toes lengthened, splitting or fusing to bear weight on spongy ground. They were still uncertain things, more fragile than formidable, yet they carried within them the idea of endurance, the ability to cover distance, to graze and move on, to follow the rhythm of growth and regrowth. Predators were few and clumsy, remnants of an older age. Their bodies were large, their movements slow, their hunger ill-suited for this new world of quicksilver prey. They faded, one by one, leaving behind open spaces where the smaller hunters would one day rise. For now, the air belonged to insects and birds, the earth to rodents and foragers, the trees to the restless little climbers that never stopped watching. The climate was unstable, a flicker between warm and cool, wet and dry. But the instability itself became the planet had become a vast experiment, guided not by design, but by persistence. Those that moved swiftly, bred quickly, and adapted without hesitation became the quiet rulers of this reborn world. Their kingdom had no boundaries, no roars or thunderous steps. It existed in the tremor of leaves, in the heartbeat of things unseen. The power of the Cenozoic was not in giants. It was in speed, in renewal, in the endless rehearsal of survival. The world no longer sought perfection through strength. It found it instead through countless small lives that refused to stop trying. In that swarm of fragile bodies, the future was learning its rhythm. What starts in shadow will soon step into sunlight. And on one isolated continent, evolution begins to dream in feathers. Far from the shifting continents to the north, a land lay sealed off by oceans, a green island of mountains, wetlands, and open plains that seemed untouched by the turmoil of the world beyond. South America was a cradle adrift, an isolated laboratory where evolution worked in secrecy, shaping forms that existed nowhere else. Here, in the heat and silence of early dawn, the age of birds reached its most ruthless expression. They were giants among feathers, predators built not for song but for pursuit. The forest racids, later called terror birds, strode across the savannas on legs built like coiled steel, their talons gripping the dust with surgical precision. Their eyes were sharp and unblinking, trained forward like the gaze of a hawk that no longer needed to fly. Where wings had once lifted ancestors into the sky, they had become tools of balance and speed, tight against bodies honed for running. The earth trembled under their charge, and the air split with the crack of impact as their curved beaks struck with the force of a hammer. They hunted by shadow and stillness. Some waited motionless among tall reeds until the rustle of a small mammal betrayed itself. Others patrolled the edges of forests, their long strides covering miles in silence. When the moment came, they lunged, fast enough to catch the fleeing shape before it could turn. Trackways found in hardened mud still tell the story. Three-toed prints cutting across the surface in powerful, measured rhythm, often ending abruptly in chaos. Lineages that had never faced true pursuit. They had grown complacent in their isolation, evolving into forms that grazed and wandered without fear. When the birds rose, that peace vanished. Evolution, locked away for millions of years, suddenly remembered violence. Across the mosaic of wetlands and savannas, a pattern repeated: speed conquering size, precision outlasting strength. The birds had no need for claws like cats or teeth like wolves. Their beaks were tools of engineering, capable of crushing bone or tearing flesh with a single twist of the neck. Their bones were hollow, their muscles light yet resilient, turning every motion into controlled energy. They were hunters of perfect economy, their movements stripped of waste. From the Andes foothills to the Atlantic coast, the rhythm of life changed. Herds grew wary, young were hidden deeper, and even reptiles began to seek cover beneath fallen logs and thick ferns. For a time, it seemed that the earth had chosen birds to inherit the throne. They ruled without competition, without challengers, under skies that no longer held their kind aloft. Theirs was not an age of flight, it was an age of dominion on foot. But power built in solitude carries a hidden flaw. Isolation gives rise to beauty and mastery, but it also breeds fragility. While South America perfected its winged hunters, the rest of the world was evolving in different directions. Beyond the sea, other predators were stirring. Mammals that were smaller, cleverer, and bound by the same restless engine that had driven the early shrew-like survivors. They learned not just to chase, but to plan, to endure hunger, to cooperate. For now, though, the continent remained unaware. Its plains echoed with the pounding steps of avian kings, and the wind carried the dry scent of fear. Fossil bones and preserved footprints whisper of that brief reign, a time when feathers ruled over fur, and when the silence after a kill hung heavier than thunder. To those who lived and died beneath their gaze, it must have seemed as if the last word truly belonged to the birds. But the story of the earth never ends where it appears to. Even as the forest racids perfected their craft, somewhere far beyond the ocean, a quiet heartbeat. Mammals listened. They came first as cautious visitors. Pakicetus was one of them, half predator, half curiosity, prowling the shallows of warm coastal deltas. It still looked like a land animal, with legs made for walking and eyes placed high on its skull to watch both above and below the surface. But it hunted with a new precision, using sound and vibration to sense movement in the water. Every dive was a small act of rebellion against gravity, a test of how far life could stretch beyond its old limits. Generation after generation, bodies began to change. Nostrils crept higher along the snout, shifting toward the crown of the head. Bones in the legs grew lighter, joints looser. The young spent more time swimming than walking. By the time Ambulocetus appeared, the transition was unmistakable. It moved with an awkward grace, sliding into the surf like a crocodile, propelling itself with strong hind limbs and a sinuous spine. Its feet were webbed, its eyes large, its ribs thicker to help it stay submerged. It hunted fish, turtles, and whatever strayed too close to the water's edge. The sea, once merely a boundary, became a refuge. It offered food, safety, and a vast emptiness untouched by land's competition. Those who could adapt found freedom in its depths. The nostrils drifted further back, the legs grew into paddles, tails widened into rudders that carved silent trails through green water. What began as curiosity turned into commitment, the return of mammals to the realm their ancestors had abandoned millions of years before. By the time Basilosaurus ruled the oceans, the transformation was complete. It was no longer a land creature testing its limits, but a sovereign of the deep, sleek and serpentine, stretching longer than any predator of its kind. Its skull bore rows of sharp teeth fit for gripping slippery prey, and its body undulated through the currents with fluid authority. The tiny hind limbs it still carried, useless for walking, hung like reminders of a forgotten world. Around it, reefs were blooming again. Coral forests rose, gone, their bones buried deep in stone. Yet their roles had not vanished, only changed hands. In the sleek bodies of these new swimmers, evolution had rewritten an old story. The shapes were different, but the purpose was the same: to master the endless blue. From the riverbanks to the open ocean, the line from Pakicetus to Basilosaurus was more than a tale of transformation. It was a reflection of nature's memory. The sea had called, and the land had answered. The waves once again belonged to giants, but this time they breathed air, carried warmth, and sang songs the earth had never heard before. Both land to ocean, the great experiment continues, but the continents themselves are not done reshaping destiny. Across the heart of Asia, where the winds rolled unbroken for hundreds of miles, the earth began to lift its horizons. The forests grew thinner, the trees farther apart, and between them stretched plains of dry grass and scattered shrubs. Out of this vast openness emerged creatures that redefined scale. Not reptiles this time, but mammals, towering and deliberate, born to walk great distances and feed on what little the land could offer. Among them was Paraceratherium, also known as Indricotherium, the largest land mammal that ever lived. It moved through the Asian woodlands like a slow tide of muscle and bone, its long neck swaying above the treetops, its small head sweeping from branch to branch. Where others had to rise on hind legs to feed, it simply leaned, pulling down entire boughs with a quiet crack. Each step it took pressed the soil into deep hollows, reshaping trails that other animals would later follow. Its legs were pillars, thick as the trunks of the trees it grazed beneath, built not for speed, but for endurance. The sheer height of its body created its own weather. Air rippled in waves of heat around its flanks. Insects drifted in the shade beneath its belly, and smaller mammals moved alongside it, feeding on the broken leaves it left behind. It was less a creature and more a moving landscape, a living ecosystem that altered everything in its path. The forests bent to its habits. Trees with soft crowns vanished first, replaced by tougher species that could regrow quickly. Bushes spread into gaps left by fallen branches. Of continents, predators did not threaten them. Even the fiercest cats of later ages would have seemed insects beside these colossi. Yet the true danger was subtler, the slow tightening of climate. Rainfall grew less certain, seasons harsher. Forests retreated, grasslands crept forward, and the giant browsers followed the shrinking green. Each drought trimmed the population, each generation born into a world slightly leaner than the last. Still, for millions of years, Paraceratherium endured. Their bones mark a chapter of quiet grandeur in the planet's history. An age when mammals proved that the mantle of gigantism need not belong to reptiles alone. They filled the empty niche once occupied by sauropods, becoming living echoes of creatures long gone. Their long necks reached into the same sky where pterosaurs had once glided. Their footprints pressed into the same earth where dinosaurs had thundered. In the end, they left no roar, no trace of drama in their disappearance. Only silence, and fossils the color of the stone that replaced them. Yet the forests they reshaped, the roots they carved, and the species that adapted around them would endure long after they vanished. The land itself remembered their passing. In the shifting winds of Central Asia, dust still carries fragments of their story. The bones lie scattered across ancient riverbeds, half buried in clay and time, as if the earth itself tried to hold on to the memory of the giants that once walked like moving mountains across its surface. While one land rises in bone and height, another transforms in silence. A single plant is about to redraw the map of the world. Began to cool, not suddenly, but with a slow, deliberate patience. Moist air thinned, and forests that had once carpeted continents started to pull back toward rivers and mountain folds. Open space spread in their absence, vast, shimmering plains that seemed to stretch into eternity. And from those spaces, a quiet revolution began. It started with fire. Lightning split the horizon. Flames tore through dry undergrowth. And when the smoke cleared, something unexpected grew from the ashes. Grasses. Tough. Expanded. The body plans of the grazers stretched to match. Legs lengthened, toes fused into hooves, spines straightened for endurance. The old forests had rewarded stealth and agility. The new plains demanded distance and speed. Horses, antelope, and early bison learned to run, not as a burst of flight, but as a sustained rhythm that could outlast pursuit. Each stride became a heartbeat of the new age, echoing across the horizon. Predators adapted in parallel. Where ambush once ruled, endurance now decided fate. Coursing hunters emerged, built for the chase rather than the leap. Early canids refined teamwork, reading each other's motion through dust and distance. Cats grew leaner, their muscles tuned for sudden acceleration. The balance between hunter and hunted transformed into a contest of stamina, precision, and timing. Wind became the sculptor of evolution. It swept unbroken across the prairies, carrying the scent of rain and dust, shaping the behavior of everything that lived beneath it. Herds gathered into great migrations, following green waves that rolled with the seasons. Calves were born in rhythm with monsoons, and death followed droughts. To live here was to move, always forward, always searching. The earth itself responded. The spread of grasses cooled the planet further, reflecting sunlight and altering the chemistry of the air. Their deep roots locked carbon into soil, while their fires released it back again, creating a pulse that tied life to atmosphere in an endless loop. What began as a simple plant became an architect of climate, redrawing the borders of continents and the destinies of species. The world that emerged was unrecognizable from the forests before it. Where once there had been shadows and vines, there were now horizons. Where life had climbed, it now ran. The grasslands were a theater of movement, and everything that entered them was rewritten by their rules. Horses galloped in shimmering lines beneath the rising sun. Antelope carved invisible paths through silver waves of seed heads. Bison gathered into dark tides that moved like weather across the plains. And behind them, always near enough to remind them of the price of stillness, came the predators. Silent, tireless, their eyes fixed on the chase. Grass had done what no single force since the fall of the dinosaurs had managed, honed for the single act of ending another life. The early rulers of this carnivorous dawn were the creodonts, a lineage that carried the memory of an older world. Their skulls were long and low, their jaws built like shears. The largest among them, creatures like Hyaenodon, could crush bone with the precision of a machine. Their bodies were taut with muscle, their shoulders sloping toward powerful haunches made for the sprint. They were not pack hunters, nor subtle tacticians. They were instruments of brute efficiency. When they struck, they did so alone. For a time, it worked. On the open plains and in the recovering forests, Hyaenodon and its kin ruled without rival. They stalked by scent, waited by waterholes, and ambushed with sudden bursts of speed. Their teeth met like twin blades, slicing through flesh and tendon in a single motion. The earth still carried their marks, deep grooves in bones, testaments to precision and violence. Nothing stood against them for long. The age of reptiles had ended in fire, but this new dominion was built on hunger, sharpened into skill. Yet success carries within it the seeds of downfall. Specialization, while powerful, is brittle. The creodonts became masters of one craft, killing in a world that never stopped changing. Their bodies, perfect for ambush, were too heavy for long chases. Their teeth, designed for slicing, shattered against the bones of tougher prey. Their senses, attuned to close encounters, failed in the new wide openness of grasslands where herds could see danger coming from miles away. Evolution had sculpted them into weapons, but weapons that could not adapt once the rules of battle changed. Meanwhile, smaller predators began to evolve in the margins. Nimble, curious, cooperative, early canids and felids were unremarkable at first, living in the shadows of the great creodonts. But they learned a different kind of patience. Where Hyaenodon relied on overwhelming force, these newcomers depended on endurance and strategy. They hunted in pairs or groups, coordinating silently across the open plain. They could run farther, react faster, and retreat when needed. Their jaws might not have crushed bone with the same finality, but they made up failure. The reign of the creodonts ended not in battle, but in obsolescence. The very specialization that had made them supreme became their trap. Evolution had whispered a cruel illusion that bite force wins forever. But in the endless game of life, survival does not favor the strongest jaws. It favors the minds and bodies that can rewrite themselves when the world demands it. The bones of Hyaenodon rest now in silent stone, jaws still locked as if ready to strike. They are monuments to a truth older than memory. Every empire built on strength alone eventually breaks under the weight of its own perfection. The age of bite and claw dominates for now, but isolation in the south is writing a very different story. While other continents connected and traded life like drifting seeds, South America remained adrift in solitude, its own continent, its own experiment. Across its mountains, jungles, and golden plains, evolution unfolded in secrecy, crafting creatures that seemed to echo the rest of the world, yet belonged entirely to themselves. It was a parallel Earth, familiar in shape but alien in lineage. Here, the ground trembled not beneath hooves but beneath claws. The glyptodons, armored giants with shells thick as stone, lumbered across the savannas like living fortresses. Each was a dome of bone, fused plates forming a carapace so strong it could turn aside the bite of any predator that dared to challenge it. Their tails ended in spiked clubs, swung low and slow, capable of shattering the ribs of rivals. They grazed in small groups, chewing coarse plants, moving methodically from patch to patch. Sunlight glinted off their patterned armor like mosaics of earth and bone. Beside them wandered the giant ground sloths, mammals of improbable grace despite their size. Some stood twice the height of a man when rearing up to feed, their claws curling like scythes around branches heavy with leaves. Their movements were unhurried, as if time itself stretched for them. They shaped forests simply by living, toppling trees to reach the crowns, opening clearings where new growth flourished. Around their heavy feet, smaller creatures thrived, feeding on the tender shoots that followed destruction. Every action, even their slowest gesture, rewrote the landscape. And then there was work of evolution repeating itself in isolation. Nature, it seemed, could arrive at the same solutions by entirely different paths. Herbivores evolved height to reach food, armor to resist attack, speed to escape danger. The logic was universal, only the language differed. Predators here were few and cautious. Marsupial carnivores, descendants of ancient stock, prowled the edges of this abundance. They were fierce but fragile, relying on stealth rather than strength. The prey they faced had adapted too well. Shells that no fang could pierce, hides too thick for claws, bodies that outweighed any hunter tenfold. And so a strange balance endured, a continent where power was measured not by violence, but by endurance and design. Seasons shifted, rains returned and withdrew, yet the system held steady for millions of years. Isolation was both protection and prison. It kept the foreign competitors away, but also sealed evolution within its own echo chamber. The animals of South America became masterpieces of stability, each perfected for its niche, each irreplaceable within the delicate rhythm of its land. This menagerie of armor and height moved through a world that felt self-contained, untouched by time's wider current. But far to the north, continents were drifting closer, seas narrowing, land bridges forming in secret beneath the waves. Change was coming, carried not by wind or tide, but by the slow tectonic breath of the earth itself. For now, though, South America stood apart. Its plains ruled by armored grazers, its forests by gentle giants, its rivers by beasts that resembled none and all of what had come before. It was a portrait of balance within isolation, a reminder that even separated worlds can find their own kind of harmony, until the borders of that solitude begin to crumble. For millions of years, balance holds, until the earth itself decides to bridge what time had kept apart. For millions of years, the two great continents had faced one another across a restless sea. North and South America, twin worlds divided by salt water and silence. Each had evolved in its own solitude, filling its landscapes with creatures that mirrored yet never met. But deep beneath the ocean, unseen by any living thing, that moved in clouds of dust, they poured southward, crossing the new land in waves, their hooves striking rhythms no ear in South America had ever heard. To the creatures waiting there, the invasion was like the arrival of a storm, swift, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Predators stalked prey that had never learned to fear them, and the rules of survival, rewritten by isolation, no longer held. But the tide moved both ways. From the south rose an answering migration. Armadillos clanked across the narrow isthmus, their shells gleaming in the tropical sun. Opossums crept north under cover of night, curious and adaptable. Ground sloths, giants of patient hunger, followed the forests upward, venturing into lands they had never seen. The bridge did not belong to one world or the other. It was the meeting point of all that life had divided. What followed was chaos balanced by creation. The old ecosystems collided, and the earth trembled under the weight of their mingling. Some species vanished almost instantly, undone by predators faster or craftier than any they had faced before. Others flourished beyond imagination, finding new worlds ready to receive them. The northern invaders, cats, wolves, and hoofed grazers, spread rapidly, reshaping South America's open lands. Yet the southern travelers, slower and stranger, also carved their mark. Armadillos became icons of the northern deserts. Opossums slipped into forests and cities alike, their eyes glinting from shadows that had never known such guests. The exchange was not equal, and perhaps that is what makes it haunting. For reasons still debated by those who study the bones, more northern creatures survived in the south than southern ones in the north. The balance of success leaned toward the invaders, though no single cause explains why. Climate, competition, disease, each played a part, yet none tells the full story. The earth had opened a gate and life rushed through it, but the outcome remained an unsolved equation. In the wake of this great crossing, the continents ceased to be separate, suspended in that narrow corridor between two worlds that were never meant to stay apart. Worlds collide, and nothing stays the same. But even as continents join, Africa's old pulse keeps the rhythm of change alive. Africa, the ancient heart of life, began to move to a new rhythm. The climate pulsed like a slow drum, wet seasons swelling the forests, dry winds thinning them again. Each cycle reshaped the land, a breathing continent where green came and went in great rhythmic waves. The creatures that lived there learned to move in step with that pulse, adapting not to permanence, but to change itself. The forests no longer stood unbroken, they advanced and retreated with the rains, opening long corridors of grass between the trees. Rivers that once flowed endlessly now shrank to threads in the heat, then roared back to life with the storms. It was a living metronome, marking time with abundance and scarcity. Those who survived did so not by resisting these swings, but by learning to dance with them. From this rhythm emerged the giants that would come to define the continent. Elephants, the quiet architects of the land, refined their bodies into instruments of survival. Their teeth became vast millstones of enamel, able to grind bark, leaves, and grass alike. Their trunks, fused noses, and upper lips grew into tools more versatile than claws or fangs, capable of uprooting trees, lifting calves, and drawing water from dry riverbeds. Wherever they walked, they shaped the landscape. Forests gave way to open glades, grasslands widened, and in their wake, new life followed. They were not merely part of the ecosystem, they were its rhythm section, keeping the beat steady. Where elephants brought strength, the giraffes brought grace. They rose on lengthening legs and necks, reaching into scattered canopies for the highest leaves. Each generation stretched a little farther, spine and sinew following opportunity skyward. Their spots mirrored the dappled light of the trees, and their tongues darkened to withstand the sun as they wound between thorns. In every motion, they were reflections of the fragmented forests that birthed them, elegant survivors of a landscape that refused speed, bodies sculpted for short-lived perfection. Lions relied on strategy and patience, turning family into advantage. Hyenas, clever and relentless, blurred the boundary between hunter and scavenger, thriving where others failed. Each drought, each rainfall, retuned this living orchestra. When water returned, grass rose like fresh melody. When it vanished, dust silenced the plains. Elephants opened paths to hidden springs. Giraffes migrated to the last surviving acacias. And the antelope moved in shimmering lines toward rain they could smell before it fell. Nothing in Africa stayed constant. It was a land in motion, driven by its own heartbeat, a rhythm that favored resilience over dominance, adaptation over strength. Even extinction here seemed less an end than a rest between notes. soon filled by a new variation of life. Through that endless pulse, one truth held steady. The continent did not just host evolution, it conducted it. Every migration, every feeding, every roar and trumpet was part of a greater pattern. Africa was not a place of peace nor of chaos. It was the rhythm of the earth made visible, a living score still being written, line by line, across the dust and green. A bast of evolution echoes northward into a continent carved by ice and memory. The north began to shiver. What had once been temperate and green slowly fell under the rule of cold. Mountains grew crowns of ice that refused to melt, and valleys filled with silence so deep it seemed eternal. The continent of Europe became a land between worlds, half buried in glaciers, half alive with breath and steam rising from its thawing edges. Ice advanced like a slow tide, carving the earth as it came. It ground mountains to powder and left behind vast plains of stone and dust. Rivers shifted course under the weight, frozen in mid-flow, then burst free with roaring floods when warmth returned. The landscape changed with each breath of climate, forests blooming, dying, and blooming again in a cycle of centuries. To live generation carried the memory of 1,000 winters in its blood. Reindeer migrated through the open plains, their hooves clicking like brittle bells against the frozen crust. Musk oxen stood unmoving in the blizzards, their breath turning to ice in the air. Foxes and wolves followed in their paths, weaving through the white in patient pursuit. Even in the coldest months, the land pulsed with quiet motion, an ecosystem sculpted not by warmth, but by the spaces between it. As the ice withdrew and returned in endless rhythm, caves became more than shelter. They turned into archives, bones piled in corners where predators dragged their kills. Ash settled from ancient fires, layered thin as parchment between centuries of sediment. On the walls, colors appeared, reds, ochres, blacks, figures of animals drawn by hands still unrecognized by the world around them. Bison, mammoths, horses, all painted with precision and reverence, as though their spirits needed to be kept alive when the earth slept. These images, simple yet deliberate, merged with the rhythm of the natural world. They were not yet marks of dominance, but of witness, reflections of beings still uncertain of their place among the great mammals they observed. The caves became meeting grounds between instinct and awareness, places where life and memory shared the same breath. When the glaciers retreated once more, they left behind valleys filled with bones, entire generations sealed beneath the melt. Grass reclaimed the tundra, and the rivers sang again through the stone channels carved by the ice. But even as the warmth returned, the shadows of those frozen ages lingered in the earth's veins. Europe had become a continent of memory, its landscapes written by ice, its stories whispered in caves. The mammoths and rhinoceroses still roamed, the bears still slept, unaware that a new kind of presence was beginning to stir nearby, one that watched, remembered, and painted. The balance of the wild remained intact for now, but the hand that traced animals on stone would not always remain invisible. The ice would come again, but so would thought, and neither would ever leave the world unchanged. Companions, but quarry. Its teeth, each larger than a man's hand, were serrated monuments to violence, tools evolved not for piercing, but for severing. When it struck, it did not chase. It calculated. A single bite could cripple. A second could end. Entire species of marine mammals evolved patterns of migration simply to avoid its hunting grounds. Its world was one of warmth and abundance. Coral reefs gleamed beneath clear shallows. Turtles drifted lazily through sunlit bays, and sea cows grazed in endless meadows of seagrass. In such conditions, the Megalodon thrived, its massive body sustained by the constant feast of the tropics. Every coastline from the Pacific to the Atlantic bore its mark. Scattered teeth, fractured bones, and legends written into the fossil record. But the ocean is never loyal. Beneath its surface, the planet was cooling again. Ice began to reclaim the poles, and with it came a slow rearrangement of the currents that carried life around the globe. The warm seas that had once been Megalodon's hunting ground turned unpredictable, colder, deeper, fragmented. The whales, once its plentiful prey, followed the changing paths of plankton and krill into colder waters. They grew larger, faster, and learned to travel farther than their hunter could. The Megalodon's empire began to shrink. A creature built for abundance now faced scarcity. Its size, once its greatest weapon, became its burden. It needed warmth to maintain power, food to sustain weight, stability to rule. As the oceans cooled, none of these remained constant. In the new seas, smaller, colder-blooded hunters began to rise, efficient, flexible, unbound by bulk. Among them was the great white shark, a fraction of its size, yet perfectly adapted to the shifting world. The great whites hunted differently. They thrived in cooler waters, striking from below with precision rather than sheer force. Their smaller bodies required less energy, their migrations wider and more responsive to climate. They could wait, endure, and adapt. Coral reefs recovered, ecosystems recalibrated, and the ocean's balance shifted once more. The age of giants had ended again, leaving only relics, massive teeth resting in layers of stone, each one whispering of a time when terror had a shape and it moved unseen beneath the waves. Even the sea's giants must yield to change. On land, the next kings sharpened their claws in silence. The grasslands of the New World glimmered beneath a pale sun, endless and restless. Herds of bison and camels moved in tides across the plains, their hooves drumming the rhythm of life. But in the tall grass, the silence between heartbeats hid something older, coiled and waiting. From that stillness, the kings of the ambush ruled, predators sculpted not for endurance or pursuit, but for the single, perfect moment. Smilodon was the masterpiece of this design. Its body was compact and powerful, shoulders rising like armor over forelimbs built for grappling rather than running. The great sabers that curved from its jaws were both its weapon and its burden. Fragile if used recklessly, fatal if used right. It did not chase its prey through open fields. It waited in cover, launching itself in bursts of impossible force. Once it struck, it held on, pinning massive animals with claws that could hook into flesh like anchors. Then, in a precise upward slash, it ended the struggle before it truly began. Its every muscle told the story of patience. Short limbs, heavy bones, and immense chest muscles spoke of restraint, a life spent not in motion, but in tension. To see Smilodon was to see power condensed, strength that did not waste itself on the chase. It ruled through precision, through the control of chaos. Around it, the plains pulsed with other hunters, dire wolves, larger and heavier than any living wolves, roamed in organized bands, following herds for days, wearing them down before moving in for the kill. The American lion, taller and broader than its African cousin, stalked the same prey from the edges of forest and canyon. Between these predators stretched a delicate equilibrium of fear and opportunity, each species shaping the other's strategy in an endless evolutionary duel. And victim. For all their power, they walked the edge of their own design. Smilodon's world was a masterpiece of specialization. Everything in its anatomy spoke to a single purpose: to kill large prey swiftly in close combat. But specialization, as always, is a fragile throne. When climates shifted again, when herds began to vanish and forests reclaimed the plains, such perfection became a trap. The short legs that made Smilodon a master of the ambush also made it slow to flee starvation. Its massive chest and narrow hips were built for strength, not distance. The tools that had once granted dominance became the very reasons for decline. As prey dwindled, the open plains fell silent. The dire wolves and lions adapted longer, hunting smaller animals, spreading farther. But Smilodon, crafted for singular precision, had nowhere to turn. It lingered for a while in the southern lands, its bones mixing with the earliest traces of humankind, before the last of its kind vanished into history. To those who would later uncover its skulls, its teeth seemed the pinnacle of evolution, the apex of predatory design. But nature leaves no endpoints. The sabers, magnificent and terrible, were not a conclusion, but a momentary shape in a river that never stops flowing. The perfection of the ambush was beautiful, but beauty in nature is never permanent. The kings of the ambush had reigned, and like every empire before them, they had mistaken mastery for eternity. The hunters reign for a heartbeat in time, but beyond the frost and wind, a horned shadow still walks the edge of myth. Across the wind-beaten steppes of Eurasia moved a creature both ancient and improbable, a giant, shaped by the cold breath of the late Ice Age, cloaked in coarse hair and silence. From a distance, it might have seemed like one of the woolly rhinoceroses that had long ruled those plains. But Elasmotherium was different, taller than any of its kin, heavier than the mammoths that sometimes wandered beside it. It carried on its brow a single massive ridge of bone, the base for a horn so great that even time could not fully erase its legend. It was not a creature of speed, but of endurance. Its limbs were thick and sure, built for combat or display. It was likely dense and keratinous, perhaps used to dig through snow to reach buried grass, or to scrape bark from trees when forage ran thin. Yet to any who glimpsed it from afar, through mist or stormlight, it must have seemed otherworldly, a single towering point rising from a creature of massive, patient strength. The steppe it roamed was a mosaic of life in motion. Herds of horses and saiga antelope passed like shadows over the horizon, while mammoths trailed the rivers in search of softer ground. In this company, Elasmotherium appeared both familiar and strange, a relic that had survived too long, carrying the shape of a bygone world into an age already preparing for something new. Even as glaciers retreated and climates warmed, it endured. Its heavy coat, its slow metabolism, its habits born of hunger, all seemed out of step with the changing earth. Yet it lingered far longer than its relatives, wandering the plains while the first humans were already kindling small fires in the distance. They would have seen it, massive, shaggy, crowned with that impossible horn, moving through fog and dusk like a living memory. Perhaps they sketched its outline in the dust, or whispered of it when the wind howled across the steppe. No one could know then that they were watching the last of its kind. Droughts grew harsher, grasslands shifted, and the giant's specialized life began to falter. Its numbers dwindled quietly, its tracks fading from the riverbanks, its bones buried beneath the thawing earth. But its image remained, etched not in stone, but in the mind. Long after it was gone, tales persisted of a great beast with one horn that wandered the cold lands, fierce yet gentle, a spirit of endurance made flesh. The truth of bone gave way to the dream of purity. The creature of earth became the creature of legend. The world moved on, but somewhere in the stories told around early fires, the echo of elasmotherium remained, a shadow of the last unicorn walking through snow that never truly melted. Legends are born as the cold begins to break. Across the open plains, the world prepares for its final harmony of beasts and wind. Feeding on the regrowth that followed, each species performed its task as if guided by invisible law, an endless cycle of grazing, trampling, fertilizing, and renewal that kept the land breathing, even in cold. The mammoth steppe was not a forest, nor a desert, nor a tundra. It was something between them all, a biome born of wind and endurance. Grasses ruled where trees could not, binding the frozen ground against erosion. Their roots reached deep, anchoring the soil, while the herds above stirred it into life. The animals were not just inhabitants, but engineers. Every step of a mammoth churned the earth, every bite of a horse clipped it to grow again. They carried the seeds of the next season in their fur and dung, sowing future meadows as they walked. Predators watched from the ridges and riverbanks. Wolves, cave lions, and scimitar cats, sleek and patient, following the movement of the herds like shadows following light. Their kills fed the scavengers, hyenas, ravens, Arctic foxes, even insects that survived the frost. Nothing went to waste. The death of one life fed 100 others, and the balance held. When snow fell thick, predators thinned the weak. When spring returned, new calves and foals filled the emptiness they left behind. Above, the sky was immense and pale, clouds trailing long ribbons across the low sun. The seasons moved not by months, but by centuries. Glaciers advanced and retreated at the edges of the world. Yet the steppe remained constant, a corridor of stability amid shifting extremes. In its rhythm of hooves and wind lay the quiet intelligence of ecosystems working as one. Even fire, that unpredictable sculptor of the wild, played its part. Lightning set the plains ablaze, clearing old growth and returning nutrients to the soil. Within weeks, shoots of green pierced the ash, and the herds came back to feed. Destruction and renewal were no longer opposites here. They were phases of the same eternal pulse. The mammoth steppe was also a highway of life. Across its breadth, species mingled and dispersed. Mammoths that grazed near Europe's rivers shared kin with those that roamed the Bering Plains, and the great herds still marched beneath it, endless as time. They were the caretakers of a living world, each step echoing the steady rhythm of an earth that, for a brief and shining age, had found perfect balance between ice and life. Balance holds, perfect, fleeting, but new footsteps approach, soft yet irreversible. Australia stood apart, ancient and strange, a continent adrift in both time and isolation. Its soils were old and thin, its rivers fickle, its seasons ruled more by fire than by rain. Yet within this harshness thrived a collection of beings found nowhere else, a living archive of what the rest of the world had long forgotten. Here, evolution had written its own language, and its grammar was built from pouches, claws, and quiet endurance. Across the interior plains moved Diprotodon, the largest marsupial ever to live. It was a giant cousin of the wombat, its bulk as great as a rhinoceros, its feet soft-padded to carry weight across sand and scrub. It browsed on eucalyptus leaves and saltbush, slow and deliberate, traveling in small herds that left wide, trampled paths between waterholes. Where it grazed, the land opened, seeds scattered, and new growth followed in its wake. The continent had few true giants, but Diprotodon carried the calm authority of one who had no rivals. Nearby, enormous kangaroos bounded through dry woodland, some taller than a man, their tendons coiled like springs. They did not leap for show, but for necessity, the easiest way to cover vast, thirsty distances in a land that punished hesitation. At dusk, their silhouettes flickered across the horizon like echoes of motion itself, the thump of their landings blending with the heartbeat of the continent. But even among these herbivores moved predators of equal wonder. The lacoleo, the marsupial lion, stalked the forests and rocky escarpments, its jaws short but terrifyingly strong, its front paws tipped with retractable claws that could shear flesh and climb stone. Unlike cats, it bore its young in a pouch, and its lineage stretched back through lineages untouched by placental kin. It was the answer evolution gave when asked to imagine a lion without ever having seen one. Lurk shoots. Fire did not end life here. It reset it. The land itself seemed to breathe through flame. Scattered among the cliffs and caves, faint traces of rock art began to appear. Handprints, animals, spirals of pigment, the earliest gestures of awareness in this southern world. They told of memory, of observation, perhaps of reverence. The shapes of kangaroos and diprotodons stood beside stylized tracks of predators and the swirling marks of fire. These were not yet warnings or records of conquest, but reflections of a world in balance, a recognition of kinship with the living landscape. But balance never lasts forever. The air grew drier, the rains less reliable. Lakes shrank, and the corridors of green that connected one refuge to another began to wither. Drought pressed harder with each passing millennium, and with it came competition, hunger, and fire that burned hotter than before. The large herbivores wandered farther between waterholes, their trails becoming lines of desperation. Predators followed, leaner and hungrier than ever. The pressure built slowly, unseen at first, but relentless. Aridity tightened its grip, seasons stretched thin, and the land that had once been a haven of giants became a crucible. Australia's rule of the marsupial still held, but the ground beneath it was changing, its ancient rhythm faltering as the continent's long, solitary experiment approached its final test. Across oceans, the fire of humanity spreads. The age of giants trembles before the smallest of arrivals. Moral world was warming again. Glaciers retreated toward the poles, rivers found new paths through softening valleys, and the once frozen grasslands turned green and restless. Across continents, the air carried more than pollen and dust. It carried footsteps. From the heart of Africa came a species small in stature, but boundless in curiosity. They walked upright, carried fire, and dreamed in shapes and colors unseen before. In time, they would cross deserts, mountains, and oceans. Wherever they went, they brought not just tools and stories, but change itself. The migrations began quietly. Bands of humans followed rivers into the Middle East, then fanned out across Eurasia, traced to weave together into a force the giants could not withstand. Each continent told its own version of the same story. As forests receded and grasslands changed, the great herbivores found their range shrinking. They bred slowly, their young few and long nursed, while humans multiplied quickly and carried with them spears, traps, and fire. Hunting began as necessity, but necessity soon turned to mastery. Herds thinned, migrations faltered, and the balance that had endured for millions of years began to crumble. Climate pressed from above, hunger pressed from below. Droughts grew longer, winters harsher. The very precision that had once made giants so successful, their slow cycles, their specialized diets, became their downfall in a world that no longer waited. The mammoths fell first in the west, the ground sloths in the south, the diprotodons in the far east. The elasmotherium, that quiet grazer of frozen plains, vanished into myth just as the last of its kind disappeared beyond the horizon. And yet not all perished. Some endured, by shrinking rather than fighting. Elephants and rhinos survived in pockets where food and shade still remained. Whales, once hunted by the Megalodon, carried the memory of the deep into a new age of seas. Rodents, bats, and shrews, small, quick, and restless, thrived beneath the feet of change, inheriting the earth not through power but through persistence. The great animals left more than bones behind. They left impressions in human thought. Around fires, their images transformed, massive shapes reimagined in fear and awe. A mammoth skull, with its hollow nasal cavity, could be mistaken for the single eye of a giant, giving rise to tales of cyclopes. The fading shadow of elasmotherium became the seed of the unicorn myth, its horn a symbol not of strength, but of purity. Legends filled the space that extinction left empty, turning memory into story so the loss might be easier to bear. The age of giants ended, but their echoes remained, in stories, in fossils, in the patterns of ecosystems that still bore their marks. The Holocene doll of its rhythm, or the architects of its silence. The story of life has never been about who ruled, but who remembered. And now, the memory belongs to us.